Industrial music for industrial people. This was the motto of Industrial Records, a label started by a band with a very tasty name, Throbbing Gristle. And the start of industrial is more clear-cut than many genres, although I'm sure there will still be arguments in the comments about it anyway, because this is the internet. Throbbing Gristle's confrontational and shocking live performances were ground zero for industrial music, and their second annual report was the first industrial album. It wasn't coming from nowhere, because no genre ever does. Throbbing Gristle was influenced by musique concrète, a tradition going back to the 1940s, and the composer Pierre Schaeffer. It incorporates field recordings, musical instruments, some of them obscured or transformed, and it was the first musical style to incorporate tape loops. Halim El-Dab, an Egyptian-American composer, created the earliest known use of tape loops in a 1944 composition. Then in the 50s, you had Elektronische Musik, the first merging of digital and analog instruments. Fast forward to the 1970s, and you have the German experimentalists cluster going wild and crazy with tape loops and instruments. You have Kraftwerk and Yellow Magic Orchestra incorporating industrial sounds into commercial musical pieces. Anyway, if I spend too long on proto-industrial, we'll never talk about the actual industrial music. I'm just saying there's a whole lot of history that informed the inception point, and it includes Frank Zappa too. Today we're going to start a journey into industrial, and researching this video has been a bit of a journey for me as well. I've never gone deep into the history of industrial, and compared to a lot of the genres I've covered on Eclecticism, I've spent less time listening to it. So the last month I've been listening to a ton, I've been cramming like a test is coming up, and learning as much as I had time to. With that said, I'm gonna be covering a lot, and I'm likely to make a mistake or two, or more. Once you kindly folk of YouTube have respectfully pointed out my gaffes in the comments, I'll put those mistakes in the description. Honestly, most comments have been super nice, and I have learned a lot from those of you who have left them. In fact, the repeated requests for this topic, by Jace the Mind Sculptor in particular, have made me decide to cover this topic now and not wait on it. So if there's a topic you really want to see, it does pay off to bring it up down in the comments. I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism. If you like to learn about music scenes and genres, and get more music recommendations than you know what to do with, please subscribe. I have lots of plans for this channel in 2025, and some of them are kicking off very soon. If you want to enable me to do more, become an enabler on the Patreon. This will give you more input on future videos, access to content not available on YouTube, and sneak peeks into what's coming up. There's even a spin-off project I'd like to do more collaboratively with other music fans, and the Patreon is going to be where that project gets started. I don't want to disclose too much, so for now, let's just call it something benign like Project 2025. Sorry, is it too soon for that joke? Anyway, let's talk about the Industrial Revolution. Throbbing Gristle was industrial's inception, and this was an ugly birth. In some sections, second annual report reminds me of Tangerine Dream's spacey ambience, but instead of sounding like outer space, it sounds more like some unsettled nightmare landscape. The first song with lyrics includes a graphic triple murder and a castration, spoken over layers of bubbling noise, some sounding like it came from musical instruments, some clearly from field recordings. The lyrics do set the tone for the album, but I enjoy the second annual report the most when it's purely exploring sound, or when the voice of Genesis Peorage is just a sound in the mix. And when it's doing that, this has some very beautiful moments for me. Depending on your taste, maybe transcendently ugly is a better way to put it. Following their second annual report, they released DOA, the third and final report of Throbbing Gristle, which was neither the third nor the final. This is a more varied affair, and because of it, maybe a bit less consistent for me than the previous album. It's even darker, further from its influences, and pushing the limits of taste even more. You have tracks on here composed by individual band members, which led to the greater variety of sounds explored. By the way, Throbbing Gristle was confrontational in more than just their music. Their lyrics and stage show were, according to some of their accounts, intended to show the hypocrisy of conservative British politics. Their stage shows involved projected film that sometimes paired footage of industrial workers with footage of totalitarian imagery, including the swastika. Some shows were accompanied by footage of hardcore porn. They also included some suggestive images of a very young girl in the sleeve for the third annual report. And this is one place where I don't care as much about the intent of the artistic statement. The girl was definitely too young to understand or consent. Their third album, 20 Jazz Funk Greats, is often spoken of as their most essential. I think these three albums are widely different enough that you should hear them all if you want a good sense of the band. But definitely try out 20 Jazz Funk Greats and the second annual report, which are both quite different from one another, and then you still get to hear the starting point of industrial as well. The band members from Throbbing Gristle would go on to other musical projects. Cozy Fanny Tootie and Chris Carter formed Chris and Cozy, and they've been an influential duo on a variety of dance music styles. Genesis Peorage and Peter Christopherson formed Psychic TV, a long-lasting band with a lot of range in their sound. And then Christopherson went on to form Coil with John Balance. Of all these offshoots, Coil is the one I think must be covered here. This started as John Balance's solo musical project, but Peter Christopherson joined before their first official release, 1984's How to Destroy Angels EP. Their first album, Scatology, is one I've seen often listed on top of industrial albums lists, or close to the top, but my strong preference is the next album, Horse Rotorvator. From the beginning of track 1, this album's full of harsh loops, both musical and abrasive. Lyrically, there's a more directed darkness than on Throbbing Gristle. There's also a queerness, which if you're looking for it, carries through much of industrial, but is maybe more explicit here. Ostia deals with the murder of a queer film director, while Slur has theatrical and soaring backup vocals from Mark Almond. Circle of Mania starts with what sounds like a drag show, and the first track is called The Anal Staircase. The subtext was apparent enough that the album was not stocked in major retailers on release. John Balance and Peter Christopherson were life partners, from the time John Balance was 19 and Christopherson 26. They remained together until Balance died at the age of 42. It sounds like they both enjoyed plenty of recreational drugs, but Christopherson seems to have been the one keeping things together for as long as they did. In addition to Coil, he had a day job with Hypnosis, an art design group who created some of the most iconic album covers ever, for artists like Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Wishbone Ash, Syd Barrett, and UFO. We just won't talk about their Black Sabbath covers. The final album by Coil, The Ape of Naples, is my very favorite. A beautiful melding of acoustic instrumentation and electronics that I think might be a gentler introduction of this band if you aren't sure whether industrial is your thing yet. Given John Balance's death prior to finishing this album, many of the tracks on here seem eerily prescient, although Balance wrote often about his own mortality, so it's not surprising some of that was on this album. A line from The Tattooed Man is particularly haunting to me. There's a man lying down in a grave somewhere with the same tattoos as me. The experiments of Throbbing Gristle started in 1976, and the first few years of this genre include some other bands starting to experiment with this intersection of sounds. Another pillar of industrial music would come from Sheffield, Cabaret Voltaire. All the way back in the early 70s, Chris Watson was trying to make music without musical instruments. Like Throbbing Gristle, they were inspired by Dada artists, a theme with numerous early industrial bands, and they were also inspired by the work of Brian Eno and Roxy Music. Their first show was before the punk explosion, a time when audiences were a bit less accepting of the confrontational and weird. The show ended with a fistfight between the band and members of the audience, and that wasn't the only show where something similar happened. The trio played shows opening for Joy Division as well, and the strangeness of their music was accepted, or at least better tolerated, in this context. Their debut album was released in 1979, Mix Up, and they had a very productive first era before the departure of Chris Watson in 1981. The highest point for me from this era was Red Mecca from 1981. This album explores the rhetorical similarities between America's Christian right and rising Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East, a theme they'd begun exploring on the previous album, Three Mantras. That album had featured a sidelong track called Western Mantra, and another called Eastern Mantra, each exploring one of these phenomena. Red Mecca has a less obvious connection to the idea, but even the title Red Mecca was a reference to this continued fascination. It's an experimental album, but also starts to bring in some dance elements, a direction that Cabaret Voltaire would continue moving in over time. Here, the balance feels forward-looking, as industrial music would move further in the direction of both dance and groove throughout the 80s. Its political worries are still relevant, and it's an album that would influence many of the industrial artists later to come. If you also want to explore the band's later dancey fun and dip your toe into some electro-industrial, I recommend Microphonies from 1984. This is full of fun electro-industrial and is probably the Cabaret Voltaire album I actually listen to the most. It's very consistent and full of excellent grooves and memorable choruses, showing a more accessible and maybe even sexy side of the music. Well, it's hard to call anything with this album cover sexy, but still. So let's get out of the UK, at least for a minute, and talk about what was happening in Germany. Oh, for fuck's sake. Okay, here's my best attempt. Einstürzende Neubauten. It means collapsing new buildings, which is the coolest industrial band name I can think of. They formed in 1980 in West Berlin, starting off very experimental and noisy. They used a lot of their own custom-made instruments, some of which were pretty much just power tools. They were playing pipes, saws, sheets of metal. Blixa Bargeld was screaming into the mic. Basically, these kids were making a goddamn racket. It sounds like 90 coked up 12-year-olds have taken over a factory. Their first album, Collapse, is very experimental, aggressive, and rhythmic, with the sounds almost completely sounding like they're made with weird machinery, just chugging and crashing metal sounds, forming something that ranges from feeling like extremely harsh dance music to some songs that are just percussive noise and shouting. This one wasn't destined for Top of the Pops. As someone still kind of new to this band, I found their third album a much more accessible entry point. Halbermensch has the experimentation of the first album, but it feels less like they're just getting off on making chaotic noise, and you can hear clearer structures behind the noise. The vocals show more variety with some chanting choruses, more singing. All in all, it sounds like they had more time to figure out what sounds they wanted to force out of all those poor tortured objects they were playing. My take on Collapse could be because I'm such a noob to this genre. When I first heard Throbbing Gristle, which was quite a while ago now, I did not get it at all. Then coming back to them after having explored more krautrock and knowing what to expect a bit more, I genuinely started enjoying Second Annual Report, then Jazz Funk Greats, and eventually even DOA. That could happen for me with Collapse as well, and I wouldn't be at all surprised. But if you're also new to this early industrial stuff, you might find the increased musicality of Halbermensch an easier place to start than with their first couple albums. This band is still going strong, with 13 albums at this point, and I've only started my exploration. They've had crossovers with a number of other important industrial artists too. Fad Gadget, for example, who I covered when I was talking about underrated post-punk. Vocalist Blixa Bargeld joined Nick Cave's birthday party in 1983, the band, not the party, and when it disbanded, joined Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. He remained in both Einstürzende Neubauten and the Bad Seeds until 2003, when he decided to focus completely on Einstürzende Neubauten. I must have said it right at least once, right? Now let's pop down to Spain, where we have a band making a brutal deconstruction of dance music. Esplendor Geométrico, formed in 1980, split off from the excellent synth band Aviator Dro. I've only explored Esplendor Geométrico's very early stuff so far, but it's minimal, it's harsh. It feels like the sharp, metallic skeletons of dance tracks with everything stripped off of them that can be. It makes me think a little of the band Suicide, but even more minimal, more of a lo-fi industrial pulse with occasional harsh vocals. On their hypnotic 9-minute Maria Luisa, the vocals sound like they're growled or gurgled in a way that feels much more close to metal from the 90s than anything from industrial at this time. They've been going since the 80s and have released 23 albums and a variety of singles and comps. The most recent comp is a retrospective called 40 Años Nos Iluminan Volume 1. So I'm still very new to this band. I don't know if this is the best starting place or not, but after I put on EG1 for just a few minutes, I knew I had to talk about the band. It's interesting to see such a different development and approach to industrial happening away from the epicenters of the UK and Germany, although the band themselves didn't actually think they were industrial. And Arturo Lenz from the band at one point said, "I think the only industrial band was Throbbing Gristle." I sometimes find myself getting bored by EBM that's too repetitive, and I feel the same way about early Swans. I'm gonna get some comments for that. But for some reason, the lo-fi pulsations of the earlier Esplendor Geométrico records feel so primitive and minimal that I'm pulled in despite them often being even more repetitive. I'm looking forward to exploring them more, and this is where they fit in chronologically, so I wanted to just touch on them quickly here. But let's move on to a band that I've been listening to for a lot longer, Killing Joke. To preface this, Killing Joke dip in and out of industrial territory. I'm covering them for 3 reasons. 1, they make some significant industrial rock in their early and then in their late career. B, they've been influential on some big names in industrial, like Ministry, Godflesh, and 9 Inch Nails. And 3, I like them, and it's my channel. Killing Joke began in 1979 in Notting Hill, England. The lineup hasn't been stable throughout, but the 4 founding members have all been in the band more often than not since then. That would be Jazz Coleman, vocalist and keyboardist, Geordie Walker on guitar, Paul Ferguson on bass, and Youth on drums. Their self-titled album from 1980 is grinding, heavy, rhythmic, and full of political anger and paranoia. It was recorded as live as possible in the studio, and they engineered it themselves, making the album in around 2 weeks. This was a serious mission statement of an album. Post-punk, but with a harsh edge that would influence many industrial artists to come. This feels like a distinct approach to industrial dance music, which was happening parallel to the development of electronic body music. They continued with What's This For? Although the album cover for this one doesn't go quite as hard as the debut, the sound definitely does. It expands a bit upon what they did on the debut, with drumming that feels even more tribal, just as many powerful riffs in my opinion, and powerfully bellowed vocals. I can't really pick a favorite between these first 2 albums, really, and I think taken together, they're a great place to start with getting a feeling for Killing Joke, at least in their early era. Then they had an excellent phase of post-punk that is a bit close to goth, and this was around the mid-80s. Nighttime has their biggest hit, Love Like Blood, which is intensely catchy. This album was a surprise to me, having come straight from their first few albums, with how melodic and comparatively inviting it feels. But if you're worried they got soft, it was a temporary exploration, and they've had some powerful industrial metal releases in their later career. My favorites of these are their second self-titled album from 2003, and Hosannas from the Basements of Hell from 2006. Exploring these 3 eras will give you a strong sense of their range, but this is one of those bands that I find the majority of their work consistently good, with enough evolution to make their whole career worth diving into. I'm sorry, I realize if you watch a lot of these videos, I'm giving you a lot of homework. I was talking to my brother the other day, and he mentioned that when the channel started, he'd actually make himself a list of all the albums and try to listen to them, but he quickly just couldn't keep up. So remember, the fastest way to get at least a taste of everything in these episodes is to check out the playlist link in the description. It's available on YouTube and Spotify, and it'll cover both the artists I get a chance to talk about, and some others that I would have liked to talk about but just didn't have time in the episode. The Killing Joke crew had some controversy due to imagery they used, which was sometimes considered shocking or superficially aligned with fascism. For instance, the photo used on a promotional poster of an abbot returning the salute of Nazi soldiers. This photo was later used on the cover of a compilation they made, Laugh, I Nearly Bought One. And this shocking right-wing imagery is a trend throughout industrial music. We've already mentioned Throbbing Gristle, toying around with fascist imagery and other shock tactics like pornography. But one of the most confounding bands in this regard might be Laibach. This band formed in Slovenia, and like Throbbing Gristle, were the musical extension of an art collective. This art collective, NSK, which stands for Neuschlewensche Kunst. I hope you Germans out there are enjoying this as much as I do when I hear one of you try to say the word squirrel.
Sprayer. Einmal. Sprayer.
Stroll?
I'll probably miss some of the nuance in this, being some dipshit from the other side of the globe, but I'm gonna do my best. NSK was a political art collective that toyed around with totalitarian and nationalist movements' imagery, appropriating these symbols in their art in a way that confronted Slovenians in particular with their historical connections to German culture. More broadly, their artwork served as a reminder of the ongoing allure of nationalism. As a band, Laibach was the perfect encapsulation of this idea. They also adopted imagery of the far right, dressed and continue to dress in military chic, adopted a logo which is a cross within a gear. Their music feels like it's the patriotic music of some kitschy dystopia, with German spoken word or an operatic bellow, gang chanting that sounds like a bunch of marching infantry, cheesy synths on occasion, every element adding to this whole fascist vibe. Not only has the band continued to the present, but they're method actors with this shit. They don't break character in interviews, and if it weren't for the express purposes of the art collective they're a part of, there would be little to establish them as not actual political extremists. But instead, they're just incredibly dedicated LARPers who want to remind us of how alluring nationalism can be, a fact that a lot of us are pretty fucking aware of right now, but a fact that can be easily forgotten nonetheless. So for starting your authoritarian adventure, I recommend Opus Dei. This is so kitschy, so hilarious, and so over the top, it's wonderful. It even has a rewritten nationalistic take on the Queen song One Vision, which has been rechristened Birth of the Nation. With soaring keyboards and violins and pomp and grandiosity, it has all the characteristics of the original, but instead of one race, one dream, sounding like a call for unity, it sounds like we're about to get our genocide on. And this Queen cover is not the most over-the-top moment of the album, which is pretty impressive. It's full of equally fun yet absurd sorts of moments. And I'm just talking about their exploration of music and the things they're doing with it, and their vocals. You actually don't need to read a translation to understand what's going on here the majority of the time. The music communicates that nationalistic spirit. This one might be the best choice for getting your boogie on while watching the fall of democracy, depending on where you live. I know what you're thinking. This video is almost over, and this guy hasn't even talked about Front 242, Ministry, Skinny Puppy. This video is not a full history, because there are a lot of great bands I would like to cover, so instead of trying to hit all the most obvious names at once, I wanted to focus on the earlier bands I think should be on your radar, and tried to include a few that might not be super obscure, but might be new to some of you. And soon, there's going to be a part 2 of this video that'll cover another set of bands that are equally important to the history of industrial. We'll also get into some more EBM, which I kinda just sidelined for this one. Remember, if you don't have the time or obsessiveness to listen to a bunch of full albums, check out the playlist link in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please watch to the end, please subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Both of those things do help the channel more than you might realize. And if you're a big fan and want to help the channel and see all of the bonus content, check out the Patreon page. This has been episode 16 of Eclecticism, and I'll see you on the B-side. God, that's terrible.